Hi class, welcome to this unit where we look at Mexican history after those first short years, months of Iturbide's Mexican Empire. Something new filled in this vacuum that really had begun back in 1810 or 1808 when the Napoleonic forces seized the King of Spain. And it kind of was this political vacuum, and what emerges in its place is quite problematic. And so far in Mexican history, in its short year and a bit, nothing has stuck. So we're going to kind of look politically at this, especially, and economics will play a role. You'll need to understand what liberalism is, liberalismo and conservatismo. They are specific arguments at that time, by Mexicans. Of course, federalism and centralism, institutionalism, and for some of you, a new term, caudilloism. So, returning to the narrative, something is politically going to take the place of the empire, and it will be some sort of republic. So, after the plan to unseat Iturbide was successful, then they follow what various places in the Americas, a few places in Europe have done, and that is to create a constitutional Congress, a group coming together to agree upon a written constitution, which is very Enlightenment, very liberalism, and the Mexican elite, who, don't forget, are Creoles, right? They a few years earlier, they were in New Spain. They meet and begin to do this. And in their attempt to create, not an attempt, but in their process of creating a constitution, it quickly emerges that liberalism is favored by a certain group of Mexican intellectuals and leaders and political leaders, and conservatism is favored by others. The liberalism, then, generally speaking, is in favor of what the Enlightenment has been advocating for a few decades, and that is sovereignty rests with the people, the governed. You should have a representative government, a representative assembly, separation of the different branches, checks and balances, free trade capitalism, open up the ports, a society made of some sort of equality among citizens before the law. And conservatism wants the pre-Enlightenment world that Mexico had lived for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so that makes sense to many Mexicans. Rank, hierarchy, a society made of many different groups of people who were not equal but together create the whole. You heard me talking about this in the previous ones. And then again, should power be diffused, which is federalism, or should it be centralized? And both of these two they do not line up exactly. Liberal federalist, conservative centralist. I'll be clear, but they could tend to go that way. Moving forward, then, by 1824, they have created a constitution which has some similarities to the U.S. Constitution of 1787. It is definitely federalist, which would be, it's more federalist kind of than the Constitution of 1787 in U.S., that's for sure. More like the Articles of Confederation, where the states retain a lot of power. There are 23 units, which you'll see on the next slide. They do the old Montesquieu's spirit of the laws, the separations of powers. In this case, similar to the United States, I want to point out, the president is elected not by the population, but by the state legislatures. I know in the United States, some state legislatures did elect, the electors for the Electoral College. There is a teensy bit more of almost democracy in the American case, but still, to this day, right, the American population isn't directly voting for the president. So, and then civil rights. These civil rights of right to speech and right to press, and not to be detained without cause and these types of things, but not freedom of religion. Right? So that is one that was not. Some Federalists, liberals would want that, but even some liberals maybe not so into that part of liberalism. So Catholic monopoly on religious life still remains. Okay, so there is Guadalupe Victoria. He's one of the main liberals, along with Gomez Farias. Here is a reproduction of a map of this Mexico, of the 23 entities that will vote for president. So again, one vote from each state, so you need a majority of the 23 to become the presidency. So I did already cover some of this, so this next slides will be a little bigger, quicker. There's Guadalupe Victoria and Gomez Farias, very famous Mexican liberals. They are not the majority, but they're not the minority. They're just right there, a solid group. And as I already mentioned from the previous slide, they have inherited ideas from the Enlightenment. And if you get rid of privilege that the pre-Enlightenment used to have and allow people to use their skills, then the country does better. Now, like many liberals around Europe and in the Americas, these were rights that were supposed to be for the upper classes, and most agree with this. Only the most radical of liberals wanted all men to have it, or even all adult men and women. That would be very rare in Mexico and in the United States at this time. The percentage of American liberals who wanted civil rights and the vote to all men, regardless of race, was pretty small for that. Well, this is not a U.S. history class, so I'm going to keep moving on. Conservatives like Anastasio Bustamante and Lucas Alamán, who's a great writer of early Mexican history. If you become a graduate student in Mexican history, you'll read a lot of what Lucas was writing. They represent the position of conservatism, which I've gone over: a corporate society, a Catholic monopoly, order, rank, hierarchy, centralized authority to carry out and make sure that the forms of rule are done correctly from the top down, and also limitation to the elites. So from 1824, moving forward, this constitution was in place for about 8 years. In the first election for president, and there were congressional elections as well, Guadalupe Victoria was elected president. And when you read in the book, you'll see that as far as foreign policy, he's doing fairly well. But the main ogre that is haunting and harming the ability of Mexican political and economic systems to work still remains. The economy since 1811 has gone downhill, and so economically the country is still wobbling. And this means that the state doesn't have the revenues that it needs to function very well. So it makes it a weak state. And as much as those of us in this class, who is either all of us or none of us, really hate taxes and want low taxes, one consequence of too low of taxes is a lack of revenue for your state to carry out functions that it needs to. So anyway, this moved on for a few years. One part of the Constitution I haven't mentioned yet, but I'm bringing up now because it's timely, is that the second place vote, who was your opponent usually, was your vice president. So you had a president of one group and a vice president of another. And in these bad times of a bad economy and bad revenue, Nicolas Bravo and the conservatives rebelled, created armies and rebelled against their own president. It failed because Guerrero, there I got it, he's down there on the bottom left. He looks pretty Stalin in his portrait. And an important person in this chapter, as you have already found out if you've read Antonio de Santa Anna. They fought on the president's side. And so, but it is, although not successful, it shows you the model that's going to be moving forward as vice presidents. There'll even be a president that rebels against itself. That's always interesting. It's kind of quirky. But there are the governments of the executive are constantly under threat of being overthrown, and the state itself and the systems of democracy just aren't developing very well. Then in the next election, Vicente Guerrero became president, but kind of like 1827, it's a little more complicated than that. He actually lost the vote, but then seized power instead. So again, if you were rooting for the liberals as the good guys in quotation marks, and those conservatives as the bad guys, that's just not always the case. You're going to, meaning good or bad, meaning seizing power or following democratic rule. Guerrero's not going to follow the vote. He says, nope, I know that was the vote. He doesn't have as many words as maybe presidents might do today, but he seizes power. He has the right armies like he did 1 year before. Now, as a liberal, he abolishes slavery, which is a very liberal idea. Again, American liberalism is very compromised by this and doesn't do that. Mexican liberalism does, and not too many areas are really upset by it. Just that Texas area up there, which we're going to get to, right? And using Santa Anna, they are able to defeat a Spanish royal army who comes to retake Mexico and isn't able to do that. Now, 1 year into Vicente Guerrero's presidency, Anastasio Bustamante, again, the vice president is of a different party, rebels, and this time the conservative army does win. There's a major betrayal. You can read about it in 1831, so it's a long rebellion. And so Guerrero is killed. So what you'll find is, since we started this way back in 1810, most leaders who have been at the head of the rebel armies or the head, especially of Mexico, have died, and by execution. So again, just a reminder that there's been an economic decline since 1810, with reduced state revenues but continued state expenses, and armies are very, very expensive, and that is a problem as well as banditry. The Mexican government from Mexico City does not have the executive police force to reach out into the areas very, very well. Here's a chart that you don't have to memorize, but you'll notice that income falls way short of expenditures year after year after year. This is just 39 up till the war begins, right, in 46. So just some pictures from the book you'll probably recognize when we're looking at society. You would have on the left, by the way, these are pretty well-established conservatives. So there's some clerics there as well, while the ones on the right have kind of embraced this urban liberalism. This is kind of funny. Chalco, which some of you might remember from the Aztec period or the conquest period. So this is really just outside of Mexico City. This is about, other than Mexico City, maybe a little bit in Puebla. The cities are pretty small in size. Here is Mérida in Yucatan. This is an area where Native Americans are producing henequen, and still the main transport is being done by humans. This is going on since the 1300s at least, and it remains the most economical way to transport goods, even in the 1800s. But what this does show you is that economically they're not developing in a way that is becoming more industrial, more urban, where Britain and Belgium and the United States have started to develop a bit. There is a population growth since 1820, but it's not growing strongly. This brings us then to another element to understand, so that you understand Mexican history and that you can explain it and analyze it in your projects, and that is caudilloism. So a caudillo is a local strongman. Depending on the context of where you're studying history, I know a lot of people in here study Japanese history or other areas. It's like a warlord. It's a person who has control over a smaller area, not as big as a nation, and is the military leader, but also is the boss of people below him who have people below them, and altogether they have access to an army, usually a mobile army, in the case of Latin America in the early 1800s or before 1850. So Santa Anna is the most skilled of all the caudillos. He's not the only one, and he and others can raise armies against the government, who sometimes can, but often cannot, create a government army that can put them down. And as caudillos, like Santa Anna or others, constantly rise in rebellion in Mexican history up till 1848, bullet point number 3 tells you the most important part of that. That means that institutions of rule, as opposed to people ruling, like personal rule, institutional rule never really gets going. And so this concept of, in American history, for example, the Federalists were beginning to act unconstitutionally towards Anti-Federalists and arresting them for their ideas and for their speech, and all this going up towards 1800, which is, of course, not establishing powerful institutions of freedom of speech. But in 1800, in the election, when they lost the election, they didn't raise up an army and seize the government anyways, right? And they didn't attack the Capitol building or anything like that. There wasn't one yet. What they did was say, okay, you won the election, we'll get you next time. And that's the establishment of, institutional rule. It's, not the only part, but it's one part. You got Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court, and all that. Those things are starting to develop in the United States. They're not in Mexico. And so the ability of a caudillo to constantly threaten or take over the government keeps these institutions from developing very well, because institutions don't do very well against canon. Canon does better. So that just leads us to an interesting question, just to keep on the side, like, is Santa Anna creating the instability because of his actions? Or is the instability creating Santa Anna, right? Does chaos create caudillos? Do caudillos create chaos? Certainly both are correct in a way. And so, just building on my explanation already, it's usually a rural landowner who has wealth, but also has access to warriors. So especially, it just depends on where you are, so we'll just leave it at that. If you were to study Argentina, it would be caudillos have access to cowboys, on mounted warriors on horseback. So with the state and ideologies not doing well ever since Mexican independence in 1821, caudillos are kind of filling up this power vacuum that really does start, as I suggested, in 1808. So liberals, of course, say that's not how you're supposed to rule. That's a dictatorship. And so here is a late 1845 political cartoon showing the problems of Santa Anna, who, as you're going to find out, will fight for the liberals or the conservatives. And in fact, once he's even going to be president, but let his vice president rule, then come back and attack his vice president's government. And that's the famous one where a president rebelled against himself, although that's not exactly true. Okay, so there was a faulty video, and so the next video will take off from here, and it will take off after Santa Anna, because the conservatives are going to begin to move and gain in power. And as they do so, they'll move forward with a new constitution that's going to be more conservative. And now we'll see how that affects Mexican history. The conservatives will take over. All right. See you in the next video.